Hi everyone. This is the second lesson on malaria and mosquitoes. In the previous lesson, of course, we took a look at the link between malaria and mosquitoes and the unicellular parasite, the Plasmodium. Today, what we're actually going to do is we're going to explore the asexual phase of the Plasmodium's life cycle. What you're going to identify in this lesson is the fact that this Plasmodium requires the human body to be able to survive. So let's take a look at how this actually works. First of all, I'll take you through the overview of the lesson, where you will learn the asexual phase of the Plasmodium's life cycle, like I just mentioned. Now, to be successful in the lesson, you have to watch this video. You should also take some notes. Now, I'll actually be taking the notes alongside you, so that'll help you also tailor your notes. You'll be able to fully explain the asexual phase of the Plasmodium's life cycle. Of course, this will take some work because this life cycle is actually very complicated. And then you're going to use the diagram that I've provided to reflect all the stages of that asexual phase. Now, this, of course, is an independent lesson, so you'll be watching this video, and the link, of course, is up on the website. Don't forget to take notes, complete the diagram provided, and then you will answer questions 1 and 3, I believe. I may have changed that, but we'll double check because we'll do this together as well. And then I'll need you to provide some feedback on Verso, just like in the previous lesson. All right, now if you go to your anticipation guide, please, let's go through the statements and decide whether at the start of the topic you agree or disagree with this. So I can explain the processes that occur in the extra-erythrocytic phase of the Plasmodium's life cycle. I can explain the processes that occur in the erythrocytic phase of the Plasmodium's life cycle. And I can represent in a diagram the asexual life cycle of the malarial Plasmodium. So decide whether or not you agree or disagree. Now, if you disagree with these, that's fine, because we will go over these today in the lesson. If there are any that you do agree with, take a look at what your understanding is versus what we're going to also cover in this lesson, and see if your understanding actually matches up with that one. All right, so there's actually this diagram that I've provided for you as a scaffold, and I'm just going to take you to the website so that you know where that is. So if we were to go to, so I'm just in Malaria and Mosquitoes on our website, and I'm just going to move down to the breakdown of the lessons. And if you would go to lesson 2, so here's lesson 2. This is what I just covered with you, as well as the anticipation guide. Here is the scaffold right here. So you actually need to make sure that you have a copy of that so that we can work through it together. You can write the notes up, if you like, on a piece of paper, so you can redraw this if you want. If you don't have a printer, that's okay. We will go through it together, and I've already got a prepared one over here, so we can write on that one together. Okay, so like I said, if you don't have a printer, just make sure that you are labeling, that you're writing up some notes and you've got the different boxes numbered. And then later on, what you can do is you can actually draw this out. If you've got a Chromebook or a laptop at home that has got a pen with it that you can write on, then you can take these notes as well directly onto this particular sheet. All right, so we'll start. Now, let's try and think about this mosquito. We're thinking about the female Anopheles mosquito, and it basically had the Plasmodium within its body. Now, when the Plasmodium actually comes, when it's inside the mosquito, the aim that the Plasmodium has in mind is basically it needs to get inside the human body, because inside the human body is where it's able to replicate. So we want it to be able to divide, and that's where it's actually going to be able to divide within the human body. So right here, if you can see that, I've just got a mosquito there, and that mosquito is about to bite somebody. Now I'm just going to show you what that looks like over here. So if you take a look at this mosquito, that section just right here that I'm just circling around, that's actually what we call the proboscis. And the proboscis is actually just like if you wish, it's just like a little tube, and it's through that tube that the mosquito is actually going to inject that into the person's skin, and then it will start to absorb the blood out of there. At the same time that it's doing that, if the Plasmodium lives within this mosquito, then what's going to happen is that this particular mosquito is going to actually get that Plasmodium into your body as well. So let's take a look. If we just go back to our diagram here. All right, so we're going to start with just looking at what is written here. So it says here, immature parasites called sporozoites. So when we're looking at an immature Plasmodium, it's actually called a sporozoite. So it is important that you understand that. And that they're in the mosquito's salivary gland at this stage. So if the mosquito is going to come and it's going to inject its proboscis into someone's skin, because it needs to inject the proboscis into the capillary, at that time, if the sporozoites live within that mosquito, then as the mosquito is drawing blood out of the human's capillaries, what it's also doing at the same time is it is releasing that particular Plasmodium or the sporozoites into the human body. So with this first box just here, what we're actually going to write is that the infected female mosquito will inject its proboscis into the host's skin, reaching the capillaries where it draws blood and releases sporozoites. So I'll just write that one up with you. So we're going to say here, female mosquito, and then that one injects proboscis. It draws blood from the capillary and releases sporozoites. Now, something that we also have to look at here is, I've said female mosquito. Now, something you have to add to that is that it has to be an infected. So this pen is not the greatest, but we'll manage. So of course it has to be an infected female mosquito, and it is infected with the sporozoites or the immature parasites. Now, we go from box number 1 and we're going to look at box number 2 over here. Now, the next thing that's going to happen is once those sporozoites have entered the blood, they actually need to travel to the liver. So here we're just going to say that sporozoites travel to liver via the blood. So it's just really important that you know that. So the first thing that's actually going to happen is we've got the sporozoites are now inside the body. The next thing they're going to do is they are going to travel through the blood and they're going to head to the liver. Now, this is a really important stage once the sporozoites reach the liver, because this is where they're actually going to mature. So right now you're just thinking it's like you've got a baby Plasmodium, and the baby Plasmodium needs to grow. Where is it going to grow? It's actually going to grow in the liver. So that's one of the first stages that it's actually going to go through. So we come to number 3 here, and we're just going to say that the sporozoites enter the liver cells. And sometimes we call these liver parenchymal cells, but that's okay. You don't need to know that. A liver cell is enough, or if you even wanted to call it a hepatocyte, that's fine, that's okay. Now, we just said, and we previously said that this is where they mature. So the sporozoites are going to mature in that particular liver cell. Now, when the sporozoite actually matures, it changes its name. So it's no longer called a sporozoite. So what happens here is that a sporozoite becomes a merozoite. And you'll see in a minute how the structure, so it's not just the name, it's even the structure actually changes. So if you notice here, it actually just looked like these little lines. By the time it's done in the liver where it matures, it actually forms almost like a triangular kind of shape, and that's what the merozoite is. Now, it's important for you to understand, remember we said that the sporozoite entered the liver cell, and in that liver cell, when it starts to mature, so here it is, let's just draw it here. Here we had a cell, and here were the sporozoites just entering that way. Now, when you get them changing into merozoites like this, in that form, this is actually called, this whole structure there is called a schizont. And it's important that you do know that. So a schizont, if you wish, is just like a sac that contains merozoites in it. So again, let's just repeat. Let's go back to number 1. We'll repeat the first 3 stages, and then we'll move on. So an infected female mosquito has these baby plasmodia inside its body, inside the salivary glands to be precise. It injects the proboscis into the human skin. And of course, we understand that underneath the human skin, we've got capillaries. So it's injecting the proboscis, just like that, into the skin. When it injects it into the skin, what's happening is the female mosquito is drawing blood, and it's drawing blood because it actually needs to nourish its eggs. Remember, we spoke about that in the previous lesson. And then as it's doing that, what's happening is it is releasing these sporozoites into the body. So remember, we said it wasn't intentional. The mosquito wasn't, that's not what the mosquito's aim was, but it just ended up doing that anyway. Now the sporozoites are inside the capillary. The next thing is, we said, they're going to go to the liver. The reason they have to travel to the liver is because that's where they're going to mature. I mentioned that the sporozoite, as it grows, is going to change into something called a merozoite. Where does it do this? It does this in the first stage in the liver cell, and that this cell that contains the merozoites is called a schizont. Okay, so that's us getting up to part 3b. Now, the next thing we want to look at is this structure here. So we've basically got, now we're looking at a blood vessel just here, and we've got these red structures. So of course you might have guessed that we're looking at a red blood cell. Now, also notice here, what's happened to this schizont is it's going to actually rupture. Now, so here, what we want to say for number 4 is that the liver cell burst, or you can say the schizont if you want, the liver cell, I'm just going to try to get this pen to work well enough for us to, so that's the liver, actually, let's see. So the liver cell bursts, releasing the merozoites. Okay, and don't worry, I will get you a copy of this handwritten just in the next few minutes once we're done with this. Now, once the liver cell bursts and it releases those merozoites, so here they are, just right here, we can see them bursting. And so the merozoites are being released. Now, from the liver, what's going to happen is they're actually going to go, these merozoites are now going to travel into the blood, and they're going to go to this red blood cell just right here. Now, these red blood cells, if you notice, have these little receptors on them, just like this. So that's actually a receptor just there. Now, that particular receptor, in this case, is called a Duffy receptor. So that's D-U-F-F-Y. So it's a Duffy receptor. And what the Duffy receptor does is it actually allows the merozoite to latch onto that receptor. So it's like a lock and key kind of structure. So what happens here is that this merozoite is going to now enter, it goes to the blood, so here's our merozoite just right here, and then it's going to latch onto that. So if you take a look, that's what it becomes. So right here we can see that they formed this complex right here. Now, what happens in this case is the following. Once the merozoite has actually attached itself to the receptor on the red blood cell, it can actually enter. But let's just write up our notes for number 5, where we're going to say that the merozoite attaches itself to the Duffy receptor. Okay. Now, after it's attached itself to the Duffy receptor, remember I told you it's now going to enter, and we can actually see that it's just entered just right there. So now we've got this merozoite is now inside, so that's just your merozoite still. And what it's done now is it's just entered that red blood cell, so it's just sitting there in that red blood cell. Now what needs to happen is it needs to mature some more. So remember, we started off with the sporozoite right at the beginning. It entered, went to the liver cell. It matured into a merozoite. The merozoite then left the liver cell, goes to the red blood cell, where it's going to mature some more. And now you're going to see why it actually needs to mature a little more. Now, the merozoite, in the first instance here for number 6, what's going to happen is that the merozoite is actually going to change. It transforms into a trophozoite. And the trophozoite actually just looks like a ring. That's all it is. It's just like a ring, like a regular ring structure. So this one here that we're looking at here, that's actually your trophozoite. Okay. Now that trophozoite then continues to grow, where it becomes, so the only thing that it grows into later is called a late trophozoite as well. So it grows into this late trophozoite, and there it is. It's just growing and growing and growing. Now, what happens there is something that you need to understand with this particular late trophozoite is what's actually happening there is as they're growing, these trophozoites, remember this is a red blood cell, and something that is found in a red blood cell, so as this starts to grow and grow and grow a little more, what it's actually doing is to grow, it's also consuming some of that hemoglobin that you've got inside your red blood cells, because they also require that to be able to grow. Now, what happens here is, as it continues and continues to grow, this particular trophozoite, later what you're going to see is it actually starts to divide. And when it divides, you see the late trophozoite is then going to transform. So that then becomes a late trophozoite. Remember, so we had a trophozoite, we then had a late trophozoite. But interestingly enough, what actually happens then is later on is that it actually then divides to form more of these triangular structures. And remember, these were called merozoites. So what it's actually doing here is it's just producing more and more of itself, because that way what it actually needs to do is it needs to replicate, or it needs to just produce more of itself. So what the parasite is actually doing in the human body is it's not only damaging the human body, but it's actually producing more of itself to be able to then form more and more and more of that particular parasite. So let's go back to the beginning. Let's just review this very quickly, and then we'll see what happens in the next stage. So we've got an infected female mosquito, has those sporozoites. It's going to inject into the skin of a person because it wants to draw out blood. In the process of it injecting into the skin of that person, it is releasing those sporozoites. The sporozoites then travel to the liver. They enter the liver, then they start to mature. As they're maturing, what happens there is they change into structures called merozoites. Now that collection of the merozoites inside a liver cell, that forms a structure called a schizont. So it's like a sac full of merozoites. Then what happens is that the sac is going to rupture. When it ruptures, the merozoites go off into the red blood cell. When they attach to the Duffy receptor on the red blood cell, they enter the red blood cell. They use up the hemoglobin in there. The merozoite changes to a trophozoite, then into a late trophozoite. And then what happens is they'll just form more merozoites. Now, when they form the merozoites, what basically happens is you're just growing the population of this particular parasite. So what happens now is we've basically got some more merozoites here. So that's what has happened in this case. We have the merozoite there. Okay. And then remember, any cell that has a collection of merozoites is actually forming something called the schizons. And then, as you can see, again, that schizon ruptures. And when it ruptures, what happens is it releases more of those merozoites, so they continue to attack the human body. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to take you back to our presentation here. Let's take a look, and we'll go through it together. So over here, so this is one that we actually just drew up on the board in school. So again, we've got all of the little parts here, so you can see all of the steps written out in order. The only step that we didn't write on our one was basically the RBC ruptures, so it's just this one here that I'm circling around. Just make sure that you add those notes to the scaffold you've got, where the RBC ruptures, releasing the merozoites, and then that basically, there are two options that can happen. Either that merozoite is going to re-enter a red blood cell, continuing the asexual phase again, so that it's just producing more of itself. The other option it's got is that it will change and they'll go into the sexual phase, which we'll talk about in the next lesson. Now, that's just an additional structure if you'd like to look at it. It may be a bit more complicated at this stage, so you may want to just get your head around the initial structure that we had, so just around, make sure you understand this one first, and then we will discuss this one when we get to the questions. Now, I've also put some extra notes on the asexual phase of the Plasmodium's life cycle, so if you wanted to go through these, you can, if you want to. There's nothing in here that is not covered in the actual notes that we just went through. So you can go through each and every one of those, basically up until you understand it really well. If you feel like you're struggling, just go back to the video and watch it again. So there, like I said, there are just these notes here. And like I said, they're just the same exact thing that we covered in that drawing. I just put them in there in case you feel like you might want to cover a bit more information. All right, so now let's go back to our anticipation guide here, and let's go back to those particular statements that we had to cover. So, do you agree or disagree? Not only by the time you've watched this video, I would actually recommend that you watch the video, take the notes, then give yourself about 30 minutes to go over this and make sure you consolidate that learning. Can you explain the processes that occur in the extra-erythrocytic phase of the Plasmodium's life cycle? What does that mean when we talk about extra-erythrocytic? So, if I take you back to this diagram here, let's go back to this one. When we're looking at all of the stages that happened in the liver, so before we get to the erythrocyte, so another name for a red blood cell is the erythrocyte. Extra erythrocyte means outside of the red blood cell. So basically what I want you to be able to do here is, can you explain steps 1, 2, 3A, 3B, and 4. So those are the 4 phases you need to know so that you can cover the anticipation guide for the first statement. Let's go back to our anticipation guide here. Then it says, I can explain the processes that occur in the erythrocytic phase of the Plasmodium's life cycle. So if we go back here, are you able to explain stages 5, 6, and 7? So basically, your first statement is phases 1 through 4, extra erythrocytic, meaning outside of the red blood cell or outside of the erythrocyte. Then 5, 6, and 7 are the erythrocytic, which are inside the red blood cell, which is also called an erythrocyte. Now, the last statement we've got, I can represent in a diagram the asexual life cycle of the malarial Plasmodium. If you were to draw this particular structure, are you able to do that just to relay the phases of the asexual life cycle of that Plasmodium? If you can do that, then that means that you have been able to cover all of those particular points. Now, the next thing that I want you to do is, once you've covered that, now, if you've covered it and you understand it really well, then that's great. if you've covered it, but you're not too sure, I need you to ask any questions on Google Classroom, and I'll endeavour to get back to you as soon as possible so that we can answer those. If you need to book in a blended learning tutorial for us to go over this, I'm happy to do that, so just let me know. Other than that, the last thing I need you to do is use the class code, just like in lesson 1. If you can please use that. There is a question there where I want you to leave feedback on malaria. So there is a question that basically says that you are expected to understand the asexual life cycle of the Plasmodium. If you can please do that, then that would be great, because then I can actually identify where you're up to. So don't forget to do that as well. Now, the only other thing that is left, we have 2 things left. If you go to section 4 in your worksheet booklet, I want you to solve questions 1 and 5. I believe in the first guide, when I gave them to you, I may have said 1 and 3. I actually want you to do 1 and 5 for this one if possible. And then again, like I said, we will put up the answer key for this one, and I'm happy to go through those questions with you as well. I've also produced a scaffold for you here. Let's open up this scaffold as well. If you find that you're struggling to understand the concepts, now over here, I've actually put what's happening step by step. So if you wanted to take notes, basically, so that you understand what's going on, you can use this to identify the asexual phase of the Plasmodium life cycle. There are only 3 major phases that I've put here. So these are the erythrocytic here. Over here, we've got the extra erythrocytic, and that's just the very first one, which is where the sporozoites are in the actual mosquito's salivary glands. Now, what I'm going to do for you is I'm actually going to write up some notes in this scaffold as well, and I'll put that up right next to this one, and that way once you finish the lesson, you can go and you can look at the notes that I've put up for you in there. I'll endeavour to type these up so that you don't have to try to analyse my handwriting. And I think that's pretty much it for this particular lesson. So let's just go through it again. We looked at our anticipation guide. You've watched the lesson. You've covered this particular scaffold. You can take extra notes here, and I'll just have the notes right next to it. Once you guys open the site, you'll be able to look at those notes. Try to solve questions 1 and 5. And leave feedback. If you feel like you're not quite sure or you don't quite understand it, book a blended learning session with me, and of course then we can go through any of the things that you don't quite understand to ensure that everyone's on the same page by the time we're done with this, before we move on to the next phase. All right, thanks for watching the video, and please let me know if you require any assistance with anything else at all.